Okay, I have three announcements to make. First of all, sections are going to meet this week except for June Hahn's sections. June is out of the country until next week. I believe if you're in his section, you've already heard from him. His sections will not meet. Those sections are section 1F, 1J, and 1L. It's the Friday 9 a.m. one of the 11 a.m. ones, and the 1 p.m. one. On Tuesday, the TA's names were not yet posted by the sections on the course webpage. Now they are. Okay, so if you're not sure which TA is yours, you just need to look to see which section number you're in, go to the course webpage, and you'll see the TA name. Okay, so June students, wait till next week. Everybody else, students of Adam, Flory, and Emily, go to your sections this afternoon or tomorrow. Okay, second announcement is some updates about enrollment. So actually two pieces of information there, one expected, one a little bit new. As expected, I was able to let in the wait list. So if you were on the wait list as of like 9 o'clock this morning or so, you're in the class, you're fine. What I didn't expect is that in letting in the wait list, I completely closed the class. Okay, and that is how it is. It's actually fine. Letting in the wait list has us way over the limit for both the room and the number of TAs we have. It means if you are not on the waiting list, your chance of getting in the class went from very low to 0. Okay, so if you're in that situation now, there's really no point in continuing to stay. Go look for another class, and hope to see you in some future Poli-Sci 30. Last announcement concerns those of you who are enrolled in the AAP program, the Academic Advancement Program, I think is what AAP stands for. Anyway, it's a tutoring program. I think if you're eligible for it, you know. The sign-ups will have started today. They'll continue through Friday of third week. Let me put up the contact information for the AAP tutor. His name is Chris. J-A-U. Chris has a class himself at this time, so that's why he's not coming to make the announcement. But he's got a sign-up sheet in Campbell Hall. I'll put his email up here and his cell phone. Jaureguisnu at gmail.com and 626-533-2058. Okay. So as I said on Tuesday, I'm just going to jump right in and set up a game and solve it for you. And in doing so, I'm not going to expect you to necessarily follow every little step or see the logic of why I'm doing everything. But I think if I go through a complete example and then go back and say, okay, why did we do it this way, not that way, that it'll just be a lot clearer. Rather than talking in abstract, we'll have a concrete example to work from. Okay, so that is what I'm going to do. And in doing that, over here, I'm going to put the Holy Trinity of game theory. Okay, every time you set up a game, every time you take a situation in the world that you're wondering about and try to put it into the game theory form to analyze it, what you are doing is you're looking for three things. Okay, I don't even need to write it again. You're looking for these three ingredients. What are the preferences? Okay, preferences have really two components. When we say we're identifying preferences, we're really identifying who are the players. Okay? Who are the different people with different goals who are both able to affect the outcome. Okay? And what do they want? All right? The second thing we want to identify specifically are the actions or the strategies. Those words are not the same thing, and in the course of today I hope you'll get to see the differences between them and the relationship that they have. But right now what we're wondering about is what can each player do? What choices do they have? Okay. Notice there's an order here. First we decide who the players are. Then for each player we think about what do they want. For each player, what can they do? What choices can they make? The third ingredient, which is often the most work in setting up a game, is to figure out what the outcomes are. Okay? What can happen in this situation? Not just what we think is going to happen, but what are the other possible things that don't happen? Something that you're going to, I hope, see very clearly this week and next is how important things that don't occur are for our understanding of what really does occur. If we want to understand why sometimes there's a war, we have to think about what else could happen. Okay? To the other side, if we want to understand why there's peace, we have to understand why sometimes there is war. Okay? So whatever we're seeing in the world, if we want to understand why it happens, we have to think about what else could happen. Okay? So the key with outcome is all the possible things that can happen, not just what really does happen. The other possibilities, the roads not taken, the dogs that don't bark, those are going to loom large in our understanding of strategy and what happens in strategic situations. Okay, all right. Still pretty abstract here. Let's switch gears and start talking about a specific case with specific players, preferences, actions, and outcomes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, did I leave point B off my outline? Yeah, I did. Well, I'll add it right now. I think there's space. I'll add it in a different color, and it's fine. Point B is this nice example. All right? Point B, we'll do an asterisk here. I'll send that up skyward for a while. Point B is our example. Okay, this example is about incumbent politicians, challengers, the people who are running against the politicians already in office, and what we'll say here is campaign strategy. Campaign strategy is pretty broad. Really what I have in mind here is fundraising strategy. Okay. How many people here have been involved in any kind of campaign? A good number. Okay. Those of you who are involved, was there more or less fundraising than you expected? Was that a bigger or a smaller deal? Or way bigger, right? And that's normally the experience people have when they first get involved in politics is they didn't believe how much time they were going to spend asking other people for money. And it's not something that most people like to do very much, including politicians. Okay? So even if you talk to very seasoned, very professional politicians, people who've been in the U.S. Congress for years, been through lots and lots of campaigns, talk to them about what they like and don't like about their job. You know, they're politicians, they're pretty upbeat people, they'll have something positive to say about just about everything, but they are hard-pressed to say that they like fundraising. Okay? It's a lot of work, it's tedious, it's thankless in many respects, but it's a huge, huge part of politics. Okay? Well, there's several puzzles about this. And one particular puzzle looms especially large in the context of congressional elections. So in this example, I hope you see that this example is becoming more and more specific as I go. That's going to be a feature of this class. In this example, the incumbents that we're thinking of are members of Congress. It applies pretty well to members of state legislatures as well, in particular state legislatures like California, where the state legislature has a lot of power and it's a pretty good job to be a member of it. Okay, so these incumbent legislators and the challengers are the challengers who run against a sitting incumbent. Now, I'm really emphasizing that the story I'm telling here is one that pertains to elections in which there is an incumbent, okay? Not to open seats, okay? Strategies, campaign strategy and fundraising strategy also in open seats is different, okay? But what we're going to look at here is just fundraising strategy for incumbents, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a puzzle. And the puzzle is this fact that you guys just told me, that there's so much fundraising that goes on by incumbent members of Congress. They really spend a lot of time doing it. Even outside of the campaign season, 2 or 3 weeknights every week, if you're a member of Congress, you're going to some kind of fundraising dinner because that's what you need to do. And what I hope you're sort of wondering now is, do they really need to do that? In some of the other classes that you've taken, if you've taken courses in American politics, in Congress especially, you might have heard about incumbency advantage. Okay? The idea is that once these guys get into office, we usually think that they've got an advantage against their challenger. Just by being a member of Congress, they get more media coverage, they get much more exposure to their constituents. The fact that they were elected from the district maybe says something about their general fit to the district, that they are demographically and politically appropriate for the district. Do they really need to raise all those funds? Especially when they say they don't like to do it. Okay? What's up with that? Well, here's a case where, if you think about what I was talking about at the end of class on Tuesday about economic versus psychological explanations, this is a case where the economic, the game theoretic explanation of why incumbents are such insatiable fundraisers is going to be different from the psychological one. A psychologist might look at that situation and invoke ideas like habit. You know, they start fundraising early on and they just get in the groove and they can't get out. Linked to that idea, you might have run across terms like learned helplessness, okay? You just you learn to do it one way and then you're helpless to switch. And as I indicated on Tuesday, I think there's something to it. That might be the answer. It's not the only answer, though. And what I want to show you today is just the existence of more fundraising than would seem to be necessary. The existence of that by itself should not be evidence for the psychological model. Okay? So we don't have to immediately conclude that the only explanation for all the fundraising we see by incumbents who don't seem to need to do it, that the only explanation for that is blinders, habit, the inability to see a better way. Okay? I'm not saying it's not that, but it doesn't have to be. Okay? The way I'm going to make that argument now is by making some specific assumptions on these 3 points. What are the preferences, what are the actions, and what are the outcomes? Okay? And in doing that, I'm going to set up a game. Something I want to point out right now is that in my little narrative right here, I've already very informally said some things about who are the players, well, incumbent and challenger, what do they want? They want to win office. That's what I'm assuming. I bet that's what you guys are assuming too. What can they do? Well, they can raise funds or not. They could raise funds to a greater or lesser extent as well, but I think we're going to think about it as yes, no here. And what are the things that could happen? Well, one person could win, the other person could win. That's it in a nutshell. Whenever we talk about politics, we are making assumptions like that. Assumptions about who's in the game, What do they want, what they can do, and how their different actions, how the actions they take affect the outcome. We always make assumptions. I really want to be clear about that. What game theory forces us to do, though, is to be very conscious of our assumptions. Okay? We always make assumptions, but we don't always make a big deal out of it. Okay? By forcing us to make a big deal out of our assumptions, game theory keeps us honest about them. Okay? Game theory might make us feel embarrassed if we assume that people that agree with me are smart and considerate and thinking about the good of society as a whole, and the people who are running against me are evil and stupid. That's not an assumption that we maybe necessarily want to make. It's an easy kind of assumption. I'm caricaturing it a bit, but it's an easy kind of assumption to make when we're not self-conscious of it. Okay? I'm emphasizing this point now because some of the resistance that people have to learning game theory, some of the resistance to learning a style of analysis that isn't our natural way of thinking, again, reminding you of what I was saying on Tuesday about natural versus deductive ways of thinking, you guys might find yourself saying, all she does is make assumptions all the time. Okay? If you say that, here's my response. Then you say that to yourself. Say back, oh, but don't we all make assumptions all the time and she's just telling us? That's what I hope I'm doing, and that's what I hope I'm teaching you to do. Okay? Not to make more assumptions than you otherwise would. Actually, I think that the more self-conscious you become about making assumptions, the less you'll do it, or the more careful you'll be about doing it. But again, just in setting up the story, my story had a lot of assumptions in it. And what I'm going to try and do now is organize those assumptions and make them very clear. Okay? So let's get right to those assumptions. Okay. Actually, before I do assumptions, what I think I'm going to do is the game tree form, which is it's a way of helping us organize our assumptions. Okay? So this scenario that I've been talking about, I'm going to argue fits a sequential game. And everything that we're going to do for the first 2 or 3 weeks is going to have a sequence to it. First, one player does something, then the other player sees what they do and reacts to it. Okay? So this part of the class is going to be about strategy in the sense of anticipating how the other player is going to react to your own choice. Okay? When there's a sequence, the player that moves first should think not just about what they want to do, okay? Do I like this choice or do I want that choice? But also to think about how the other player will react to it. Okay? To not think about the other player's action is to fail to be strategic. Okay? When there's a sequence to the real-world situation we're trying to understand, the way that we depict strategy, the picture that will help us organize all of our assumptions and figure out what they imply is a game tree. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw one. The reason why this scenario has a sequence is that incumbents move first in this story. If you're an incumbent, you become an incumbent early November, the election year. Okay? In most cases, you don't know who your challenger 2 years, or if you're a senator 6 years in the future, is going to be. Okay? You can start doing a lot of your fundraising, and indeed incumbents do start doing a lot of their fundraising before your challenger is even chosen. Okay? So incumbents make their decision about how much fundraising to do before the challenger is even in the game. Okay? That means that I'm going to set up a tree that looks like this. Okay? I'm going to draw the whole thing and then I'll talk about it. The incumbent has a choice to raise funds, not. Okay. This, we're going to do colors on this. So the green is the game tree. The red is commentary on the game tree. This is a decision node. Nodes are these things that branches come out of. Okay? So the incumbent decides to raise funds or not. Then the challenger decides whether they are going to raise funds or not. I'm abbreviating here. RF, raise funds. And here, same thing. Okay? I'm about halfway to setting up a game tree here. I've 90% of a way of setting up a game tree in terms of the amount of board space I'm going to cover, paper space, for you guys, barely short of halfway in terms of the amount of work I need to do. Okay, but let's talk about what I've done so far. What I've done is I've just represented each player with a decision node. Okay? The decision that happens first comes higher in the tree. The decision that comes second happens later. The incumbent has a choice of raising funds or not, and then the challenger has that same choice. The fact that the challenger has two decision nodes means that the challenger gets to decide her fundraising decision regardless of which choice the incumbent makes here. Okay? So the way the game gets played out, where the challenger is either going to make her decision about fundraising or not, knowing that the incumbent has raised funds, or she's going to make that same decision knowing that the incumbent has not. Okay? The challenger won't end up at both of these places, just one. And where she ends up depends on the choice of the incumbent. We will later see games where the choice that the first mover makes early on is going to affect whether the second mover has a choice, okay, and sometimes what kind of choices they have. But in this game, it does not. Okay? So again, let me emphasize, the challenger has two nodes in the game, but the challenger will only make one choice. And again, that's the idea that if we want to understand what happens, we have to think about what doesn't happen. Okay? So if what does happen is that the incumbent raises funds, we have to think about what would happen if she didn't. Okay? What would happen, what the challenger would do. If it worked out the other way and the incumbent did not raise funds, we would have to still be thinking about what would happen if the incumbent had gone the other way. Okay? So far what we've got is a game tree that has nodes that represent players and branches that represent the actions that they can take. Okay. I am going to, throughout this class, write game trees top to bottom. That's just the easiest way for me to do it. It's how I learned to do it. The book does it from left to right. Okay, same idea. Either way, it's the natural way that you would read. And what is at the top of the diagram, or to the left in the book, is what happens first in the sequential game. Okay, you'll see that it's very important in many games to know who moves first and who moves second. All right. So some of our assumptions, as I said, are actually in the game tree. Who are the players is in the game tree. Next Tuesday, I'll be giving you a homework problem that's going to be a little story. It's not going to be about incumbents and challengers, but it is going to be a political story. And you're going to have to figure out who the players are. And one of the things you want to ask yourself when you've got your game tree maybe written out just to this extent, not finished yet, is do I have all the players? If a player can make a choice that affects the outcome, they have to have at least one decision node. Okay, so if you're some of you may find it helpful to compile a little checklist of things to ask yourself to know whether you set up a game right. And one thing that should be prominent on that list is, does every player have at least one decision node? If the player doesn't have a decision node and they can affect the outcome, you've left something out of the game. Conversely, if somebody's got a decision node and their choice doesn't really affect the outcome, that would be a problem too. Okay. All right. So now what I need to do, all I need to do is to add what we call terminal nodes down here. The other phrase that we'll use for what today are going to be numbers, soon they'll be variables that I place at the bottom of the tree, is they're going to be payoffs. Okay? What we want to do is we want to add something at the bottom of each path in the tree. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 possible paths that this interaction could take, right? The incumbent could raise funds and the challenger could. The incumbent could raise funds, the challenger could not. The incumbent could not, the challenger could. The incumbent could not and the challenger could not. 4 possible paths we could go down. What we want to get to is our assumptions about the preferences of each player over each of these 4 possible outcomes. Okay? So another checklist thing that you can remember is that when you're thinking about all the possible things that could happen, the number of possibilities that you're considering, okay, the breadth of your analysis, if you will, is going to be given by the number of terminal nodes, the number of different ways to get from the top of the tree to this bottom row. Okay, so we've got 4 here. There's 4 possible outcomes that can happen. The funny thing about outcomes in setting up a game is that figuring out our assumptions about outcomes is the most work. Okay? It's where we really do have to think about counterfactuals, and we have to think about them in a lot of detail. Now, again, this is something that we do in ordinary life, too. We do it sort of intuitively, but we usually don't do it completely. And we're often not really explicit even with ourselves about what we're assuming about the counterfactuals. What we observe, we can observe it, we can pay a lot of attention to it. What we think might have happened, harder to think about, harder to communicate with somebody else about. And game theory can be very, very useful in communicating to somebody else what your ideas about a counterfactual are versus their ideas. So outcomes, in setting up a game, thinking about the possible outcomes that would be associated with each set of choices by the players is where most of the hard thinking comes in. The funny thing about it is the outcomes themselves never show up in the game. Okay? I'm going to make some notes about it here, but what we want to get to here are numbers that will indicate not the outcomes, not necessarily who wins, but how the players feel about it. Okay? Do they like the outcome or do they not like the outcome? Okay. So that's where we're going. To get there, let's start thinking about what assumptions we might make about outcomes. Okay? Now here's a place where I'm going to tell you guys a set of assumptions that I have. I think they're pretty realistic. You might not think that they're all realistic or that they all apply everywhere, and that's good. Hold those thoughts. Today is not a good day for us to talk about whether these assumptions are the right ones or not. Tuesday will be. Okay? So while I'm doing this and you're thinking, no, I don't think that's right, write it down, bring it up Tuesday. But right now, it's Professor Bawn's game. She's going to make her assumptions. All right. So the assumptions that I have, I think I'm going to do them over here. Okay. They're going to be my assumptions about outcomes. Okay. Assumption number 1. If the incumbent raises funds, she wins. If the incumbent raises funds, she wins whether the challenger raises funds or not. Okay? And I'm making this assumption based on what I'd said a few minutes ago, based on what people who've studied congressional elections for years think, that a well-funded incumbent, an incumbent who has enough money to mount a serious campaign, has a large advantage and is probably going to beat a well-funded challenger or a poorly funded challenger. Okay, so getting one more color up on the board. If the incumbent raises funds, I'm writing this in blue because, as I said a minute ago, it's not really part of the game tree. Okay? But right now it's going to help us get to what is at the bottom of the game tree, which is the preferences over these different outcomes. So if I'm the incumbent, I raise funds, you, the challenger, raise funds, I beat you. I'm the incumbent, I raise funds, you don't, I still beat you. Incumbent wins both places. Two. Incumbent does not, back to my abbreviating, raise funds. The challenger wins. Oh, excuse me, not necessarily. I wouldn't want to defend that assumption. The incumbent does not raise funds and challenger does, then the challenger wins. Okay. Third assumption in this category is neither candidate raises funds. Then we're back to the incumbent winning. Okay. So I said it's my game. I get to make my assumptions, but if I'm using this game to persuade you that I know something about congressional elections, I should persuade you that these assumptions are reasonable to make. The idea here is that if you have an incumbent that doesn't raise funds, an incumbent that's not in a position to send out mailers, have people go door to door, put on TV ads, if it's going to be that kind of campaign, is going to be at a disadvantage if the challenger is doing those things. Okay? If I'm an incumbent who has failed to raise money, I can't put my TV out there, and you're the challenger, you've got my 2 years of votes to go over and spin the worst possible way and get them out there in the mailers and on the airwaves, and that's going to be real good for you. Okay? A disadvantage that incumbents may have, even though we don't really see it a lot, is that incumbents have records to run on. And records are an easy thing for a challenger to use against an incumbent. Choices that if the incumbent could carefully explain to their constituents why they voted one way, why they failed to show up for a vote, why their office works this way and not a different way, they won't be able to make that explanation if they don't have the money to get their message out. If the challenger has money to get out the message about what's wrong with the way the incumbent has behaved and the incumbent does not have the money to respond, this is a case where a challenger could overcome the advantages of name recognition, fit to the district, whatever talents the incumbent used to originally get elected. If neither candidate has money, though, neither candidate has the funds to really mount a big campaign, then we're probably back in the situation of name recognition mattering. It's probably going to be a low turnout vote, and the incumbency advantage will probably prevail here. Okay, so let me put those outcomes again in blue. Part of my assumptions, part of the process of setting up a game, even though they would not normally appear in the game tree itself. Okay, so this path here, the one where the incumbent does not raise funds and the challenger does, this is the one where the challenger wins. Over here, maybe another way to justify that assumption, this is another path where the two candidates are sort of on even ground. Here we have two candidates who maybe are not funded to the same degree, but both have the funds to mount a campaign. Here, again, they're sort of on even grounds, neither of them having any money. When the money situation is even, we think that incumbency advantage is what's going to matter. Okay, so over here, we've got the incumbent winning. Okay, so let's go through our checklist here. We've got sort of half of what we need for preferences. We know who the players are, check. What can each player do? We've got our assumptions about that, check. They can raise funds or not. This is just kind of a restatement of it. What are all the possible things that can happen? Well, we've got them. Incumbent's going to win or the challenger is going to win. What is left is going to be the preferences of the players. And you might be thinking that that's kind of a big term for me to be using, a big set of assumptions to make. It would be, except that when we're analyzing a game, all we need to know is what are the preferences over the outcomes in the game. Okay, so not in general, what do these guys want? You know, peace on earth, a new car, also winning the election, and no more fundraising. But just what are their preferences over these four possible outcomes? Okay, that makes it a little bit simpler. It makes it a more realistic thing that we can actually talk about. Okay, and we'll put those assumptions, I think, over on the other board. No, I think actually I do have board space here. Is this good board space for everybody? Is everybody able to see this? Okay, good. All right. So I'm still in assumption land over here. I've got my assumptions about what the outcomes are. And again, let me emphasize what I mean by that. What I really mean is how the different combinations of choices by the players affect the thing that they both care about. Okay? So when I say what are the outcomes, really what I want to know is what outcomes result from each combination of actions by the players. Okay? And that's good. Check on that. Next is going to be assumptions about the preferences of candidate I. That's the incumbent. The honorable representative I. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to represent incumbents' preferences with numbers and in the most natural way to do it. A higher number means you like it better. Okay? This is the idea behind payoffs. Okay? When people use game theory to set up experiments in laboratories, and this is increasingly done in political science, economics, psychology, it's done throughout social science. Laboratory methods are kind of permeating out from psychology where they initially were. When people try to set up little lab versions of these strategic situations in a laboratory, the payoffs are often real money. Okay? Occasionally they're M&Ms or something like that, but every experiment that I've seen done in recent years, the payoff numbers are represented by money. Have any of you guys participated in any of the experiments at CASSEL? You don't even know what that is? I'm trying to remember what CASSEL stands for. It's CASSEL, so Social Science Experimental Laboratory. I don't know what the CA is. It's in the Public Policy Building. It's kind of a famous laboratory set up to do game theoretic experiments. And they do pay you. They're always looking for subjects. So if you find yourself in public policy, you might see if there's an experiment to sign up for and get some payoffs out of that. But that's a digression. All I'm saying here is that when we analyze a game, we represent preferences with numbers high number is good, low number is bad. So let's represent my assumptions about the incumbent's payoffs with some numbers here. All right. So again, I just have to represent assumptions about these 4 possible outcomes. Okay. And here's how they're going to go. Okay. These are the incumbent's preferences. Let me emphasize that again. Whenever we talk about preferences, we are always talking about the players separately. Okay? Always, always, always. Game theory has this kind of divide and conquer approach. That's how we understand a complicated situation. We break it down into components, and one way we break it down is we think about preferences being those of the individual, not of the players as a group. Okay, so incumbent's preferences over the following possible things. I'm the incumbent, wins. I does not raise funds. That's the best. I get to be in office. I get to make the world a better place and give all those big speeches and no more chicken dinners for me. That's going to be the biggest number here. Next thing, incumbent wins, incumbent raises funds. Well, that's not so good. Like I'm telling those political scientists who call me up and get me to answer surveys, I really don't like raising funds. But this number 8, this payoff number 8 that I'm assigning to it is better than the next outcome, which is that the challenger wins and the incumbent does not raise funds. Okay? These 2 numbers are key. In saying that I, being the incumbent, I have a higher payoff for winning and fundraising than I do for losing. Okay? Challenger wins means incumbent loses, and not fundraising says that if I have to raise funds to win, I'll do it. I'll bite the bullet. Okay? The worst outcome here is, gosh, what could be worse? Challenger wins, and I raised funds. Oh my God, hate that. Okay, so those are my assumptions about the preferences of the incumbent, and I'm going to assume that the challenger's preferences are symmetric. Okay, that from the challenger's point of view, the challenger winning without fundraising is the best. The challenger winning, does not raise funds. Here's the best. Not. Challenger wins with raising funds. Challenger raises funds. That's 8. Okay, so it's just symmetric here. I'm replacing the role of the incumbent with the challenger because these are my assumptions about the challenger's preferences. Best case is I win without raising funds. Next best is I win, I have to raise funds. Next best case is my opponent wins. Okay, I lose. Incumbent wins. At least I didn't raise funds. Okay. That's the 3. And the worst case would be the incumbent wins. I spent all that time fundraising. That's my lowest payoff. Okay. So where do these numbers come from? I made them up. I made them up to reflect my assumptions about what these guys want, to reflect the story that I was telling when I first developed this idea. Okay? That these guys both want to win the election, that nobody likes fundraising. The assumption that I didn't really make, what I was really not very clear about when I was just talking informally about the problem over here, was I didn't really commit myself to what I thought about the differences between these two intermediate outcomes, okay? Do they prefer to win the election and raise funds? Do they prefer one thing that they like and another thing that they don't like to losing the election and not raising funds? Okay? I think this is a reasonable order to rank these two outcomes, that if people are in politics, certainly in politics at a certain level, they probably are people who have decided that winning elections is worth the trouble to raise funds. Okay? But the point I want to emphasize here is this was a part of the story that it was very easy for me to just completely glide over when I was talking about it in ordinary language, for me to not be clear about. And this aspect of my assumptions about preferences is going to turn out to be critical to understanding what's going to happen. Okay. So now I'm actually getting pretty close to being done setting up the games. Okay. I know what the outcomes are. They're in here in blue to indicate they're not really part of the game. I set up those outcomes first because that, knowing what the outcomes are, is necessary for me to know how many things I have to assign a payoff number to. So do this. Every time you get your homework, when you're setting up the game, get yourself a list of the outcomes. While you're doing it, it's kind of natural to think about what combinations of actions they would come from. But figure out what the set of outcomes are before you sit down and organize your thoughts about what the preferences are. You need to do the outcomes first because you need to know what are the set of things you need to assign numbers to. Okay. So now I've got my numbers. Let's put them in the game, but first let's get this question.
I just don't see where, like, for one of the preferences, if the challenger wins, or the preference of the challenger winning when the incumbent didn't, or when the incumbent raised funds, is on the tree down in the chaos. Like, where is that on the chaos?
The challenger winning and the incumbent, good point. That's right. That's not in there. Okay? That's very good. That's exactly right. Now, the parallel one is going to be in here. Okay? So that's right. And it was a good point for you to bring that up. Let me just remember that I'm supposed to, for the webcasting, repeat your comments since I'm on the mic, and you're not. So what's your name? Brittany points out that Brittany's thinking about where am I going to put these numbers, okay? If these are numbers that are going to go with different outcomes, there is no outcome in this tree where the challenger wins and the incumbent raised funds, okay? The only place where the challenger wins is in this branch of the tree where the incumbent didn't fundraise, okay? And that's actually right. So if this had been kind of a hard part of the preferences for me to think about my assumptions and get clear about, I could have just skipped it. I'm not going to need this. Okay? Now it turns out that the parallel part of this is going to be in the tree, and an aspect of this set of assumptions that I like is the fact that I'm treating the incumbent and the challenger the same. I'm not presuming that there's anything special about one or the other. Okay? So it wasn't too hard for me to put this extra preference in here. But you're right, I did a little more work than I need to here. Was there another? Yes?
So is it possible for me to get a 1 and then the first one for the challenges preferences, but 10 is not possible?
You're also, what's your name? Veronica is also seeing another impossible case here, that the challenger winning without fundraising is not possible. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay? And, well, you know what? You guys are chomping at the bit to put the numbers in here, so let's put them in here. What you'll see is I've got all of the assumptions I need. I've got a little bit more. I've got a little bit more than what I need for the game. I've got quite a bit less than what you might be thinking about is going on in the real world. And that's going to be a tension that we're going to have throughout the class. Our games are much simpler than reality. Okay? That's the way we understand reality. Reality is such a hubbub of so many things going on that we have to focus our attention on some parts of it. And game theory, again, just makes us conscious of what parts we're focusing on. Okay? So my main game has quite a narrow focus. I got out of my focus a little bit over here as part of the process of explaining the logic behind the assumptions. But now that I've got my numbers, let's put them in. And while I'm doing that, let me pass along to you something that is true about this class, this time, and this professor, which is it's 8 till 12 now. And my IQ starts to decay rapidly about 50 minutes into a class period, okay? And this is devastatingly embarrassing to me, but it can be fun for you and good for you in terms of learning. So I would actually make it the 11:45 rule. Start being very sensitive to me putting numbers in the wrong places, saying things backwards. Keep me on a very short leash. Make sure that I put the numbers in the right places here. You'll have lots of rewarding chances to catch me doing something different. Okay. All right, so I've got a number. I've got a payoff for each player for each possible outcome and a few other outcomes that actually aren't in the game. And what I need to do is put those in the terminal nodes. The convention, what everybody does, and you guys do it too, please, is to put the first mover's payoff first. Okay? Everybody does it this way. Okay? So the incumbent has the first move. I'm going to put the incumbent's payoff numbers first, the challenger's second. If there's 3 players, they just go in sequential order. Okay? You could do it the other way, just like you could drive on the other side of the road, but do it the way everybody else does. You'll be glad. Okay, so what can happen here? The incumbent can raise funds. The challenger can raise funds. The incumbent wins. I'm switching back to green here because the payoffs are part of the game tree. Until you have payoffs, you haven't finished setting up the game. Okay. So what is the incumbent's payoff from going down this path in the tree? 8. Okay. This is the case where the incumbent wins. The little blue note, not really part of the game tree, but it's part of our assumptions, tells us that the incumbent wins with that combination of actions, and the incumbent had to raise funds. Okay. What's the challenger's payoff here? 1. Poor challenger. Did all that work, didn't get to win the election. Terrible payoff. All right. What's the incumbent's payoff here? It's 8. It's no different. That's going to happen in many games, right? You think we're at a different node, the incumbent's preference might be different, but the incumbent doesn't care about whether the challenger raises funds or not. Now, you could make a game where they cared, but in this game, I'm the incumbent. That challenger's out there, whatever, he's doing his thing. As long as he doesn't beat me, I don't really care what he's doing. Okay? Now, you might think that's unrealistic. You might think if the incumbent is from another party, I don't want him marshaling support for that party. I don't want him gaining a good reputation and maybe beating me next time. But in this particular model, I'm assuming that the incumbent only cares about their own fundraising and whether they win the election. Now, a more realistic way to think about that would be to assume that the incumbent's feelings about their own fundraising and winning the election are just much, much more intense. Maybe they care a little bit about the challenger, but it's not enough to put in the game. Okay. What's the challenger's payoff here? 3. Okay. You think about that 3 as sort of being the challenger's payoff for keeping their day job. Okay. I didn't win the election, but I didn't turn myself inside out with all that fundraising. It's a 3. It's fine. All right. over here, what's the incumbent's? 3, because here the roles are switched. Now, the incumbent is the one that didn't really work very hard, didn't win the election either. Challenger's payoff? 8, very good. Okay. Over here, incumbent payoff. 10, oh man, I'm the incumbent, this is the world I want to be in. Challenger's payoff? Okay, yeah. Okay, so just to re-emphasize the points that Brittany and Veronica made, this payoff never occurs. We never in this game see a challenger winning when the incumbent raised funds. So the worst thing that can happen in this game is just not going to happen to the incumbent. That seems kind of unfair. Welcome to the world of politics. And the best thing that can happen never happens to the challenger. Okay? Okay. The best possible outcome is a possibility in the game. Now, we're not going to predict that happens, at least not with these numbers. But it is allowed as a possibility. And the worst possible thing for the challenger as well. Okay. So here's another thing that people, when they first start doing game theory, find odd. One thing that people find odd is what I talked about a few minutes ago, that the outcome assumptions don't really appear in the game, but that's actually where you have to do the most thinking about. Okay, what really are my assumptions? How do I think the world works? It's the knowledge of the world, the judgment, the creative thinking that you bring to game theory. Okay, are those assumptions about outcomes, yet they don't really appear in the game. At the beginning of the class, I'll keep writing in some of the outcomes like this, and I encourage you to do it on your homework too. It's not like it's wrong, but you'll very quickly find yourself, and when you're reading the book, you'll find the book not having the blue stuff in here. Okay, so when people say write down a game tree, what they want you to write down is what's in green there. Decision nodes, at least one for each player in the game. Actions represented by branches coming out of the node, branches coming out of the node controlled by the player who's making the choice there, and payoffs in the terminal node. So that's one surprising thing. The other surprising thing is with a lot of games, the work really goes in setting them up. Once you set them up, solving them is not that hard. This game is not a hard game to solve. I don't know if I can have time to say everything we have to say about solving the game, but I can do the solution for you right now. The most important thing to remember about solving games, so important that I can't erase that. That stuff's so important, but I'll switch colors. I'll switch colors and put it over here by solving game trees, put it in a nice blue box, is you always solve a game tree from the bottom to the top. Okay? You set up a game from top to bottom or left to right. You set up a game in the order that the things happen. You solve the game backwards. So you'll even hear people using that particular phrase, and solving it backwards gives us this result. Dixit and Skeeth in your book call the process rolling back. So the image they have is like, if there's a screen, I'm going to solve this game just by kind of rolling up the branches, figuring out what would happen if we got to the very last set of nodes in the game. Thinking about that. Using what we learn about what would happen at the last set of nodes to figure out what will happen at the next to the last set of nodes. And in a more complicated game, just marching back up through. So just as with setting up the game, there's this kind of divide and conquer approach. Take this complicated situation and break it down into components. Break it down into preferences, actions, and outcomes. Solving the game also has this. Just divide it up, go step by step. Think about it one node at a time. Okay? That's going to be a feature of especially the early part of the course. None of the individual steps are that hard, okay? That's something that I think sometimes sneaks past students. I'm talking away up here, and every little step, wait till you start seeing me ask you whether 8 is a bigger number than 3 or not, and you're going to think, wow, glad I did that math pretest for this. Every little step is really easy, okay? The trick is, and the power of game theory comes from organizing all those steps, breaking down a hard problem into a medium-sized number of really easy problems. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We are going to roll back the game. We are going to solve it from the bottom up. We're going to start with the things that could happen at the last stage of the game. Okay, so say we're here. Don't think about how we got here or whether we got here, but say we're here. I'm the challenger. Okay? Everything you need to know about what I want is captured by these two numbers. What am I going to do? What am I going to do if we get to this stage? You're not going to raise funds. If we get to this point, I have a choice between 3 and 1. Okay? I have a choice between fighting a losing battle or keeping my life. I'm not going to raise funds. Okay? Now watch how I'm doing this. This is actually something, there are some aspects of setting up games and solving them where everybody does it the same way, like putting the first mover's playoff first. There'll be other ones that come up when we get to simultaneous games. Here people do things differently. What I'm doing is trying to do it the way the book does, and it's also the way I learned it. I'm highlighting what I think will happen. Okay, so I'm making this big and a new color, and I'm highlighting the optimal choice. Optimal for who? The challenger. Optimal for whoever controls the decision node. Okay? So at any game, you solve a node as a part of the process of solving the game by picking the branch that leads to the higher payoff for the player that controls the node. Okay, so in this case, it's not. I'm highlighting it. I'm making a big deal of my style of highlighting because sometimes you will see people crossing out the path not taken. Okay, that's another way to do it, as long as you're consistent. Okay, what about over here? If we get to this point, I'm the challenger. What am I going to do? We're going to raise funds. Okay, again, we're looking at the challenger. We have to look at the challenger's payoffs. I'm an ambitious politician. Do I prefer to win an election by raising funds hard to my ordinary life as an intern in some other politician's office? You bet I do. That's what I choose. Okay. All right. The way that you indicate the choice taken or the choice not taken is less important than how you take this information and transfer it to the next stage. The way that you do that is by replacing the decision node with what's called its strategic equivalent. Okay? So let me just do it first, and then I'll talk about the logic of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this node with the payoffs. Okay? I'm going to replace the challenger's decision with 8-3 and 3-8. Okay? The reason why I'm doing this is because if the incumbent is strategic, what the incumbent is going to think is that if I raise funds, even though I don't like raising funds, believe me I don't, but if I do it, it's the equivalent of getting a payoff of 8. If I don't do it, it's the equivalent of getting a payoff of 3. Okay? So this is what we mean by rolling back. Okay? It's like we no longer need to look at anything below the first branch here with the strategic equivalence. If I am the incumbent, all I need to think about is, do I want to pay off of 8 or do I want to pay off of 3? What do I want? 8. Okay. What do I do? I raise funds. Okay. So, one of you guys want to summarize what the economic story is here? Remember I said the psychological explanation of why an incumbent would raise funds could be that they just do it out of habit. Okay, so even though they don't like to do it, they're just incapable of stopping. What's the alternative that we've got here? Yeah?
For fear that if the incumbent doesn't, that the challenger will win.
For fear that if the incumbent doesn't raise funds, the challenger will win. What's your name?
Kiara.
Kiara. That was Kiara. Put it in a nutshell, and that is exactly what the game theoretic political economic story is. Okay, let's put it here. Why raise funds? Because of how the opponent would react if I didn't. Okay. Why do we raise funds? Because of the counterfactual. Okay. It's not because we like raising funds. Okay. It's clear in these assumptions that holding the election outcome constant, the incumbent's payoff is lower whenever they have to raise funds. It's lower when they win, and it's lower when they lose. Okay, so it's not that they don't like it, but that they understand how their opponent would react. We never see the opponent's reaction because the incumbent doesn't want him to do it. Okay? We never observe this happening. Okay? The reason we never observe it is because the incumbent is strategic. Yes?
Why don't we start from the bottom and go up? What's the logic behind why that works?
What's your name?
Elaine.
Elaine. Probably more than I can remember, but I might remember a few of them. So Elaine is wondering, what is the logic of this solving backwards? And that actually sets me up for another thing I want to say here, another phrase that will be helpful. I think it's a phrase that I put on the syllabus for this part of the course. The phrase is kind of an aphorism for what it means to be strategic. And the phrase is, look forward, reason backward. Okay? So the logic behind solving the game from the bottom up is the logic, it's a logic that I bet most of you guys have heard from your parents at one time. Think ahead. Think about the consequences. If you say that to your brother, how is he going to react? If you do that, what is going to happen? Okay? That's part of what parents tell their children the world round. It's part of what mentors tell their mentees in all sorts of situations. And that is the logic of being strategic. Okay? That the way to think about what you should do when you're deciding whether to raise funds or not is not to just look at your choice. Okay? If we start at the top and the incumbent said, well, look, here's my choice. I can raise funds or not. I don't like fundraising, forget about it. That wouldn't be strategic. Rather, what the incumbent should do is should think about the long-term consequences of what they are doing. What are those consequences? How do they like them? Okay, so that idea of thinking about all of the consequences and making your choice based on that, not just based on the superficial, short-run aspects of the choice, that would be a feature that I would say would characterize rational decision-making in contexts that we wouldn't even think of as strategic. What makes it a strategic situation is where part of the consequences involve anticipating what another person is going to do. Okay? So another way to think about Elaine's question would be, this kind of fits with the logic of game theory, to think about, well, what's the alternative? If I don't start at the bottom, I could start at the top, and the way I would get wrong by starting at the top is that I wouldn't be thinking about how my opponent would be reacting. Okay? I wouldn't be being strategic. Okay? This phrase, look forward, reason backward was popularized in a book that came out probably the late 80s. It's been out for a while now. It's called Thinking Strategically, and it's a good book. I recommend it to you. It's in the category of what I would think of as sort of like a popular management book. It's written, I think, mainly for business people, people thinking about professional decision making. Okay, it's meant to be advice in that sense. That's not a style of book that I'm particularly enamored with. I think most of them are pretty bad, but this is a pretty good book, and actually one of the authors of this book is one of the authors of your textbook, Avinash Dixit. So if you are interested in kind of some background reading on game theory, how it would apply in a lot of situations that are political in one sense. It's about, power and getting people to do things and conflict being resolved, but not in the sense of winning elections, voting in legislatures. It's more in the sense of getting along in an office. That book would be something that I'd recommend. It's not a hard read. Okay, it's meant to be. I think it's meant for people to read on airplanes when they're doing business travel. It seems to be that kind of book. Okay, so we've taken a situation, translated it into a game, solved the game, and done a little bit of interpreting the solution. So what we've done today is what I'm going to ask you to do on the homework problem that I'm going to hand out on Tuesday. I haven't said all I have to say about this example, so we're going to start on Tuesday by, I'll put the same picture basically back on the board and talk about some of the other things we could have done differently. Why do we do it this way? But that's where we are. Over the weekend, read, you might want to read through all of Chapter 3. Okay, we're going to spend some more time on Chapter 3, but just to get a sense of what's going on in these games.